In January of 332 BC, a 23-year-old king stood on the shores of Lebanon and looked at a mathematical impossibility. His name was Alexander, the city was Tyre, and the problem wasn't the walls. The problem was the half-mile of deep, rough ocean that stood between his army and the gates. His generals begged him to walk away. "Go to Egypt," they said. "Leave this rock alone." But Alexander understood logistics better than he understood fear. He knew that Tyre was the last naval base of the Persian Empire. If he marched south to Egypt, the Persian fleet would sail out from this harbor and cut his supply lines. He would be trapped in the desert, starved, and destroyed. So he had to take the island. But he had no ships. He had no navy. So he made a decision that violated the laws of nature. He said, "If nature opposes us, we will change nature. If there is no land, we will make land." Alexander didn't start by building, he started by destroying. There was an old city on the mainland, Old Tyre. Alexander ordered it to be erased from the map. Every temple, every house, every stone wall was dismantled. His army became a conveyor belt of rubble, 30,000 men, carrying the bones of a dead city and throwing them into the sea. The engineering began with the piles. Massive cedar trees were cut from the mountains of Lebanon. They were driven deep into the clay of the seabed to create a friction anchor. Then came the rocks, then the wood, then the earth. Inch by inch, a causeway, a mole, began to stretch out from the coast, 200 feet wide, solid enough to march a phalanx. At first the work was easy. The water near the coast was shallow, waist deep. The men sang as they worked, but then they hit the drop-off. Halfway to the city, the sea floor plunged. Suddenly the depth dropped to 3 fathoms, nearly 20 feet. The physics of the project turned against them. To fill a space that deep required exponentially more material, and the current here was vicious. The water channeled between the island and the mainland like a river. It swept away the fill before it could settle. On the walls of Tyre, the defenders watched, and they laughed. They shouted down to the Macedonians, "Are you trying to compete with Poseidon? Do you think you can carry the whole mountain into the sea?" They thought it was a joke, a young king's folly. But then they saw Alexander himself, carrying rocks, working in the mud alongside his engineers. And slowly, the laughter died. Because the road was getting closer, the water was getting shallower. The island was becoming a peninsula. The king of Tyre realized the impossible was happening. He stopped laughing, and he gave the order that would turn the construction site into a slaughterhouse. "Launch the ships." As the mole stretched into deep water, the war changed. It stopped being construction and started being a slaughter. The Tyrian navy didn't fight in a battle line, they fought like wolves. Their triremes circled the head of the causeway, raining arrows and javelins on the workers who had nowhere to hide. Every meter of progress was paid for in blood. But the real damage happened where Alexander couldn't see. Tyre deployed combat divers, men swimming without gear, holding their breath, diving into the murky undertow. They sawed through the anchor ropes. They hooked iron chains to the structural piles. Then, Tyrian ships would pull from a distance, dragging the foundation apart. Whole sections of the road simply vanished into the sea. Alexander realized he couldn't just build a road, he had to build a fortress that moved. Alexander's engineers, led by Diades of Tella, responded with a masterpiece of intimidation. They built 2 siege towers, but these weren't standard machines. They were the tallest mobile structures ever built in human history up to that day. 50 meters high, 20 stories of oak and iron. They were taller than the walls of Tyre. From the top platforms, Macedonian artillery could fire down onto the decks of the Tyrian ships. To protect against fire arrows, the engineers skinned hundreds of cattle and horses. They draped the raw, wet hides over the wooden frame. A gruesome, fire-retardant skin designed to extinguish any flame that touched it. The monsters worked. The Tyrian ships were driven back by the rain of heavy bolts. The construction resumed. The mole reached the very shadow of the city walls. Tyre was trapped. But the engineers inside Tyre had one card left to play. They looked at the wind direction, they looked at the wooden towers, and they decided to build a bomb. They took a heavy horse transport ship and stripped it down. They filled the hull with dry cedar shavings, pitch and sulfur. This wasn't just fire, it was chemistry, a mixture designed to burn hotter than wood alone. But the genius was in the trigger mechanism. On the yard arms of the masts, they hung two massive bronze cauldrons filled with volatile oil, naphtha and bitumen. They waited for a gale-force north wind. Then they lit the fuse, locked the rudder and jumped overboard. The ship became a guided missile, speeding straight toward the end of the mole. Physics took over. The ship slammed into the gap between the towers. The impact snapped the masts forward. The cauldrons tipped. Gallons of liquid accelerant vomited over the towers. The wet hides, meant to stop arrows, boiled and curled in seconds. The heat was so intense, it melted the bronze bolts holding the towers together. In 1 hour, the work of 7 months turned to ash. The towers collapsed into the Mediterranean. The mole was broken. Alexander watched his masterpiece burn. Most kings would have quit here. The logic of the world said it was over. But Alexander turned to his generals. He didn't order a retreat. He said, "We need more ships, and we need a wider road." The siege was dead. 7 months of labor had been erased by 1 hour of fire. His generals advised him to retreat. They said, "A land army cannot fight an island. It is physics. It is impossible." But Alexander realized the mistake. He had tried to defeat the sea with stones. He needed to defeat it with wood. He realized that the Persian fleet protecting Tyre wasn't actually Persian. It was a coalition of Phoenician and Cypriot ships. So he did the unexpected. He left his army on the beach and rowed north. He went to the kings of Cyprus and Sidon, who were technically serving Persia, and gave them a choice. Join the winner now or burn later. Diplomacy at the point of a spear is effective. The king of Cyprus defected with 120 warships. The king of Sidon brought 80. Rhodes sent 10. Overnight, Alexander went from having 0 ships to having the largest navy in the Mediterranean. When Alexander returned to Tyre, he staged a piece of psychological theatre. He waited for dawn. The Tyrians looked out from their walls, expecting to see the empty ocean. Instead, they saw a floating city. 223 warships, arranged in a perfect battle line. The laughter on the walls died instantly. Tyre had lost the sea. Alexander immediately ordered a blockade. He bottled up the Tyrian navy in their own harbours. Now, the engineers could work without being shot at. And this time, they didn't make the same mistake. They started the second mole, but they changed the physics. Instead of building straight out, they angled the structure 45 degrees into the prevailing wind. This deflected the force of the waves instead of absorbing it, and they changed the material matrix. They dragged whole cedar trees, branches, roots and all, and threw them into the sea first. The branches acted like rebar in concrete, trapping the rocks and clay, binding the causeway into a solid mass that the current couldn't wash away. The road moved fast. In weeks, they were back at the walls. But Tyre had one more layer of defense, a defense hidden underwater. The Tyrians had dumped massive boulders into the sea at the foot of their walls. These underwater mountains stopped Alexander's ram ships from getting close enough to strike. Alexander converted ships into floating cranes, huge winches to lasso the boulders and drag them into deep water. Tyre responded with armoured assault boats. They rushed in, cut the lifting ropes, and retreated. It was a stalemate. The ropes kept being cut, the rocks stayed put. So Alexander changed the material science of naval warfare. He ordered his smiths to forge anchor cables not out of hemp, but out of iron, chain. When the Tyrians rushed out to cut the lines, their knives sparked and shattered against the metal. The rocks were cleared. The path to the wall was open. The stage was set for the final horror. The mole finally reached the island. The iron chains held the rocks. The path was clear. But arriving wasn't the same as winning. Alexander's men stood at the foot of walls that rose 15 stories straight up. The Tyrians had been busy too. They had built wooden superstructures on top of their stone battlements, raising the height to nearly 150 feet. It was a vertical deadlock. Every time Alexander's engineers rolled a siege tower forward, it was smashed by heavy artillery from above. The mole, which had cost so much blood to build, was becoming a kill zone. A narrow strip of land where thousands of men were packed together with nowhere to dodge. The Tyrian commander saw the density of the targets below, and he decided to unleash a weapon that had never been seen in warfare before. A weapon designed not to kill, but to torture. They didn't use boiling oil. They didn't use Greek fire. They used sand, fine silica sand, gathered from the beaches, poured into massive bronze shields, and roasted over charcoal fires until it glowed red. The physics of sand are unique. It retains heat longer than water, and it doesn't evaporate. It becomes a solid-state fluid of pure thermal energy. When the Macedonians massed for an assault, the Tyrians tipped the shields. A glittering cloud of red-hot particulate matter rained down on the attackers. It looked beautiful, until it landed. If you get hit with boiling oil, it burns the skin, but it runs off. Sand is different. It is heavy. It is fine. It found the gaps in the armor, the neck, the wrists, the greaves. It poured inside the metal suits like water. Once inside, it stuck to sweaty skin and burned its way into the muscle. There was no way to get it out. To remove the sand, a soldier had to take off his armor, right in the middle of a battle, exposing himself to arrows. The result was absolute panic. Men went mad from the pain. The discipline of the Macedonian phalanx, the most disciplined force on earth, broke apart. Soldiers threw themselves into the sea just to stop the burning. The assault collapsed. Alexander watched the horror. He realized that the mole was a trap. The walls there were too thick, too high, and the defense was too horrific. He had to find another way. He stopped the frontal attacks. Instead, he took his elite ships and circled the island, sounding the depth, looking for a mistake in the architecture. And finally, on the south side of the island, facing Egypt, they found it. A section of the wall that hadn't been reinforced. A section where the bedrock was fractured. The lock had a key. While the Tyrians were busy slaughtering men on the mole with red-hot sand, they missed the movement on the south side. 2 heavy cruisers, fitted with iron rams, drifted into position against the older section of the wall. They anchored the ships to stabilize the recoil. And then, the rhythm began. Siege warfare is not about rage. It is about frequency. The heavy beams swung back and forth, hammering the same limestone blocks over and over again. Micro-fractures turned into cracks. Cracks turned into fissures. And then, physics won. The structural integrity of the south wall failed. A section of stone 20 feet wide groaned and collapsed into the sea, creating a ramp of rubble. Alexander didn't send a lieutenant. He ordered his own ship forward. He knew that the first men into the breach usually die. But he also knew that if the king didn't go, the army wouldn't follow. The Macedonians deployed a new mechanism, the flying bridges. Heavy wooden gangplanks suspended from the ship's masts, ready to drop onto the rubble. As the ships hit the rocks, the bridges dropped. The hypaspists, the elite shield-bearers, sprinted across the unstable wood. Alexander was in the first wave. The fighting at the breach was brutal. It was shoulder to shoulder, shield against shield. The Tyrians fought with the desperation of men who knew there was no retreat. But they were fighting hoplites who had conquered half of Asia. The line held for 10 minutes. Then it snapped. The Macedonians poured into the city like a flood. At the same time, the chain barriers in the harbours were broken. The Phoenician fleet sailed in. Tyre was attacked from the south, the north, and the sea. The battle moved from the walls to the streets. Tyre was a maze of tall, narrow alleys. It became a vertical kill zone. Civilians stood on the rooftops, throwing down tiles, stones, and boiling water. This turned the Macedonians from soldiers into butchers. Frustrated by the rooftop attacks, they stopped trying to capture the city. They started erasing it. The order was implicit: no quarter. For 7 months, Alexander's men had been taunted, burned, drowned, and tortured with hot sand. Now, they unleashed 7 months of rage in a single afternoon. 8,000 Tyrians died in the streets. The king of Tyre fled to the temple of Hercules, clinging to the altar. Alexander spared him, a gesture of piety to the god, not mercy to the man. But for the rest of the city, there was no mercy. 30,000 survivors were sold into slavery. But for the 2,000 men of military age who survived the fighting, Alexander reserved a special message. He ordered them to be crucified along the entire length of the coast. 2,000 crosses. A forest of dying men stretching for miles. Alexander offered his sacrifice to Hercules. He held games, he celebrated, but he left something behind that lasted longer than the victory. It was a billboard for the ancient world, a message written in wood and blood that said one thing: you can fight an army, you cannot fight the future. The island of Tyre never became an island again. The sand gathered around Alexander's mole. Over the centuries, it widened. Today, if you look at a map, Tyre is a peninsula. Alexander didn't just conquer the city, he changed the geography of the earth forever. This is the legend of the Defiant.